All right. Last time that we were talking about stuff, we were talking about how slavery, how it used to be in ancient days and ancient origins in Greece, Rome, and China. We also talked about how slavery initially was. And now we're going to move into more of the transatlantic slave trade era, which began in the late 1400s, which is different from our ancient slavery. So now, if your parents are slaves and you're born, you're also a slave. While in the past, if your parents were slaves and you were born to them, you wouldn't be a slave. So there's a bit of a change here. Let's go ahead and make a bullet, and we're going to write down this word right here, middle passage. So bullet, middle passage. The middle passage is referring to the trip from the Africa to the Americas, and kind of that just journey, that's what's called the middle passage. So when we're going from Africa over to the Americas, kind of the middle area right there, this kind of trip itself, that's called the middle passage. The middle passage is kind of hard to see with this graphic, but all these little lines right here, these are all people. This is just how they would just stack tons of people on top of each other when they're transporting people across over to the Americas. So you can see right here in the kind of graphic how you have multiple levels, and each one of those levels would have the slaves just kind of, they just lay them down and then have them chained to the ground, or I suppose in this case the floorboards. So the middle passage is referring to that kind of part of the journey of the trip. Most slaves that were brought over to the Americas were brought over to the Latin America, which I'll explain what Latin America is. But most slaves, 95% of them, were brought down to south of the United States. Go ahead and make a 1 and write down 1, 95% of slaves to Latin America. So 1, 95% of slaves to Latin America. So what is Latin America? Well, I already kind of told you that it's south of the United States. And Latin America simply refers to the nations that are south of the United States that are Catholic nations. So any place that was a Catholic nation in the United States was called Latin America. Why the word Latin for? The word Latin, the reason why they use that for is because the Bible at this time period, if you're a Catholic, was read to you and written in Latin. So the only way you could read the Bible if you're a Catholic is to know Latin, the language. So therefore, this is why the south part, everything south of the United States, is called Latin America. So even though someone may be Latin, that doesn't necessarily mean they'd be Hispanic. Hispanic is saying that they speak Spanish. But if you're from Brazil, for example, you wouldn't speak Spanish, you would speak Portuguese. Or if you're from like on these French areas down here, you would speak, French. So when we say Latin America, we're talking about people that were Catholic, which is, every nation down here was a Catholic nation. So therefore Latin Americans. When you say Hispanic, you just mean areas that people are from that speak Spanish. But that wouldn't include Brazil or the, French areas. It wouldn't include the Portuguese or French areas. All right. Number 2. I don't have on the screen, so I'll type it for you. Number 2. Most slaves went to Brazil. So as a percentage of the population, most slaves went to Brazil. So why is it that a lot of them went to south of the United States and not to the United States itself? When you think of slavery, you generally think of cotton production because that's the main thing you generally think of. The thing is, though, is that cotton production doesn't require actually a whole bunch of intensive human labor to be able to farm it. You still need a lot of humans to do it, but it doesn't require a whole bunch. There's actually another crop that requires that's way more labor intensive that you need people to work on, and it's too cold in the United States to grow it. I'll get to it in a sec what it is. So what is it that requires a ton of people to farm it? Well, that's sugar plantations. Sugar plantation is actually the main thing that requires human labor to work it. So what does sugar look like? This is sugar up here, and this is sugar when it's been cut. So you kind of see the sugar reeds right there, and then you see when it's cut what the reeds look like. So sugar requires 6 million slaves to work, while cotton, on the other hand, only required 500,000 slaves to work. So you had 12 times as many people, 12 times as many slaves doing sugar work than you did doing cotton work. So that's why you see so much slaves going to Latin America, is because to grow sugar, you need it to be hot. All right, sugar isn't something you grow in like Indiana. You could grow it, I suppose, in Florida. It might be just warm enough in Florida to grow it. But yeah, you need like a good warm environment. Brazil has a nice, good environment for it. You can also grow on like the Caribbean islands, was also pretty good for growing sugar. Coffee was another one of the major plantations. Was coffee. So coffee was another major plantation that required 2 million people to get coffee. Mining, gold, silver, iron, copper, so forth and so on. Needed 1 million people for mines in the Americas. Domestic labor, that's just people living in a house, that was 1 million people. Cotton production was 500,000 people. Cocoa cultivation, that's for coca. That would be like chocolate, right? Coca, chocolate. And then construction, just building stuff, was another 250,000 people. So in total, there was 11 million slaves in the Americas, kind of spread out from north to all the way to the south part of Americas. And you can see here a little graphic. This shows you just where slaves are kind of going to. So you see that Brazil had the highest amount. The Spanish Empire, that would be like Mexico all the way down to Panama, into like Cuba and Venezuela, and also including Cuba, was 2.5 million. The British West Indies, so that's all those little islands in the Caribbeans that were owned by the British, was 2 million. The French West Indies, which is all those little islands in the Caribbean owned by the French, was 1.6 million. In the United States and in Canada, that was 500,000. Dutch West Indies, that's places owned by the Dutch in the Caribbean, 500,000. The Danish West Indies, so places owned by the Denmark in the Caribbean, 28,000. And then there's 200,000 slaves in Europe altogether. So that just kind of shows you kind of where people went and such. And this graphic right here, this just shows you who was transporting most amount of slaves. Most of the slaves were transported by the Portuguese. All right, so they're the ones that transported the most amount. As you see, there were 30,000 voyages and 4.6 million slaves transported. So obviously, when you force people to work on the plantation, you're forcing them to do things they don't want to do. Obviously, that leaves the slave revolts, because people get ticked off getting told what to do all the time, especially when they aren't getting paid for it, and also kind of get beaten when they don't do what someone else is telling them to do. So it leads to slave revolts. We see this happen a couple times in Jamaica and in Brazil. Yeah, so you do see several slave revolts and so forth. Let's talk about culturally what Africans were able to keep when they came over to the Americas. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down culture, what remained the same. So what were Africans able to keep that was the same? Well, one, religion. We talked about traditional West African religion before, and traditional West African religion, when it comes to the Americas, a lot of that belief system still stays very much the same. We see that there are some offshoots from traditional West African religion. For example, voodoo, uh, is an offshoot of traditional West African religion. So if you ever heard of voodoo before or kind of familiar with that a little bit, that's based on traditional West African religion. So that's something that was still very much the same and still very much in the spirit of the traditional West African religion. Funerals being very much a public affair where it's like lots of people and so forth. That also remained very much part of the culture as well. That's number two, funerals. Three is ring shout. So their music and song stayed also very much the same. Ring shout is when you form a ring or a circle, usually around like a campfire, and then you do kind of dancing and singing around the campfire while continuing to kind of walk around in a circle. So that's called a ring shout. I suppose ring sing would be a better name for it, but nonetheless, ring shout is what that was called when you form a ring and you walk around the ring, walk around the circle, and you sing. So ring sing, ring shout. There you go. Four, folk art. Just the way how pictures were drawn, paintings were drawn. That stayed very much the same when Africans came over to the Americas. And five is medicine. So just a type, not exactly the same type of plants as what was in Africa they used in the Americas, but still kind of finding kind of natural herbs and so forth for medicine, which also connects to the religion as well. That was five, medicine. New bullet, what changed? Oops. New bullet, what changed? So obviously a couple things changed when the Africans came over to the Americas. You know, you went from having a free working society into a slave working society. So obviously several things changed. One of the first things that changed was language, because when you're coming over to the Americas, you know, you have English in the very northern parts in both the United States and Canada. Then you had Spanish in Mexico down through Venezuela and Cuba. You then had Portuguese in Brazil. And then you also had some Dutch in the Caribbean islands. All right. So you had a couple primary languages throughout the area. And obviously in West Africa, there's over 100 languages in just West Africa. So you had a lot of people, they weren't necessarily from the same area when they came over to the Americas. So a lot of slaves picked up just the language of their kind of slave masters, just because that way then they could communicate with other slaves and socialize with them. So obviously at first it was very hard to talk to people because you didn't know the language. And you didn't know the language that they were speaking. So two, nursing. Nursing is talking about how they're able to perform medical services and so forth. Obviously, if you're enslaved, it's very difficult to kind of get your normal herbs and so forth so that you can, heal up people and such. And also nursing when it comes to children and child rearing and bringing them up. Names also changed. So a lot of times when slaves were brought over to the Americas, they would change their name. So your name might be like Kinte. And then it's like, no, your name is now Tim. All right. So you would end up getting kind of a new name and so forth. And it would be a name in the language of whichever place you're at. So, the British kind of have like their names, Michael, for example. And then for Spanish, there are names like Jose, for example. In France, you might have like Michel, which would be like Michael, but Michel. And then you have like in Portuguese, very similar, but you would have something more like Hua, for example. So you have those different names as well, like Hoist. So a little bit different. Socializing obviously changed a lot as well. So socializing being just a way that people were able to kind of socialize and such, because again, they didn't have the same language as each other. So socialization, obviously very difficult until they kind of learn the same language. And working conditions, that's going to be number 5. So 5, working conditions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So working conditions obviously change, when once again, you're going from a free society into a slave economy. All right. Well, that's it for our notes for today.